Hello, welcome to Baltic World, the premier channel discussing news and important issues facing Northern, Central and Eastern Europe. My name is Crispin, and as 127,000 Russian troops are poised to invade the Ukraine, debate continues to rage over whether or not Vladimir Putin will give the order to attack. Now, where there is some consensus is that it is now or never. There are multiple costs and risks for Russia for further delay. Number one, it costs a lot to maintain a combat-ready army poised to attack. It's not something that the Russians are going to be able to sustain in perpetuity. Number two, the longer there is delay, the greater the defenses that Ukraine can establish, the more foreign military aid will enter Ukraine for its defense, and the greater opportunity the Americans have to organize some kind of coordinated response in retaliation for any Russian aggression. And then finally, and probably most poignantly, eventually the ice and snow will melt, and that will mean that it will go from a hard surface for tanks and armored vehicles to be able to move across rapidly into a muddy sludge. It will be incredibly difficult to make a momentous advance through Ukrainian territory at that time of year. Therefore, it is highly probable that Russia would seek to invade earlier than that, attain any kind of major military objectives in the first weeks of any campaign, and then be able to compensate for the slowdown that would come with a warming temperature. So is Russia going to invade? And if so, to what end? Or is Vladimir Putin going to recognize failure and simply back down? I will get into this debate and give you my analysis and perspective at the end. But if you find value in this discussion, please like and subscribe. And if you wish to, you can support us on Patreon. Now, on the yes camp, that is that Russia is going to invade and it is imminent, well, there's evidence stacking up on that side. First of all, the Americans, the Australians, the Germans, they've all withdrawn their families' independence from their embassy. Very unlikely to do that. The scare signal that that sends to your allies is obviously very negative. The optics are terrible, something that the Americans in particular would only contemplate if they were certain that an invasion of Ukraine was imminent. Also notice that the American embassy is in Kyiv. It implies that any Russian incursion into the Ukraine would at least threaten the capital in some major way. Of course, Russia has already withdrawn much of its personnel from its embassy, something else you do if you are worried about reprisal and are preparing for a military invasion. Of course, also the bilateral talks between the United States and Russia have been an abject failure from a Russian perspective. They have not gained any ground on any of the major demands that they put out in the public domain. And so Russia is now put in a position. Is it going to accept this failure? Or will Vladimir Putin make good on his threat to act to ensure that Ukraine can never join NATO and that the influence of American military posture in Eastern Europe is forcibly rolled back? Now, in recent weeks, I have read many think tank pieces, op-eds, analysis reports, anything in the public domain on what Russia's intentions are in Ukraine and how things will play out. And the best analysis I've seen is from a man called Dmitri Alperovitch, an analyst, a business think leader, and he's given a long thread on what he sees to be Russia's goals and ambitions and strategy. And I'm going to read it out in its entirety. It's a Twitter thread of all things. First, Russia is going to need a casus belli for attack. The most likely scenario is that Putin will create a pretext for war by manufacturing a Ukrainian attack on Russia. His other option is to try and provoke the Ukrainians into a reckless action, but that is less likely given how cautious and watchful they are for this scenario and how restricted their rules of engagement are in Donbass. The invasion will start with fires, campaign missiles, multiple launch rocket systems, howitzers, self-propelled gun mortars, and fixed-wing airstrikes against UKR air defences, air bases, entrenched defensive positions, mobilisation and command and control centres. The goal would be to quickly establish air dominance over the skies of Ukraine, impede mobilizations, and take down major communication nodes used by Ukrainians. With the enormous capabilities of Russia's long-range fires, they can bring down absolute hell on those targets. The Ukrainians lacking short and intermediate range air defenses won't be able to do much in response. Russia also has some of the best electronic warfare systems in the world. They'll be used to blind Ukrainian air defenses in the initial hours before they are destroyed with firing. Expect to see extensive use of the new Orion UAVs as well. Russians may also target TV and radio transmitters, internet exchanges, as well as the wiper malware against media and government websites to make it harder for the UKR population to receive information. They are also likely to launch psyops in cyberspace to sow confusion and despair. The fire campaign is likely to be followed by a ground invasion designed to encircle and destroy Ukrainian units east of the Dnieper River. With the forces Russia is positioning, they will be able to launch a ground attack in 4 directions. Belarus from the west, Kursk, Bryansk, and Belgorod regions in the northeast, Rostov region from the east, and up from Crimea in the south. In addition, we might see airborne VDV air assault units parachuting in to take strategic locations behind UKR lines, and naval landing ships deployed in the Black Sea and Sea Azov conduct landings near Mariupol. Perhaps later even as far as Odessa if they are feeling ambitious. The goal of the simultaneous assaults supporting by long-range fires, close air support to be eliminate organized Ukrainian defensive units or push them back to the west bank of the Dnieper. While all this is taking place, Spetsnaz operatives will likely already be deployed in eastern Ukraine and will attempt to organize uprisings in major eastern cities with previously identified armed collaborators, potentially with aid from the VDV. The goal would be to take control of the eastern cities from within before the main Russian units arrive to enforce order and help eliminate any resistance. The Russians are highly likely to stop at the east bank of the Dnieper River and not attempt to cross it so as to avoid what would be a very tough fight in western Ukraine. However, they are also bringing a lot of bridge laying and engineering equipment to have the option to cross the river, but will be a major challenge given how wide the Dnieper is in most places and while under fire from Ukrainian artillery. The Belarus front gives them an option to execute a flanking maneuver and surround Kyiv without crossing the Dnieper, but I think they are unlikely to do so given the risk of a siege of Leningrad-style battle there. Such a maneuver will also leave them open to rear attacks from the west. With such overwhelming ground, air, and naval force, assisted by on-the-ground operations by the GRU and FSB, the Russians could neutralize all major organized resistance in the east within 60 days. Eastern Ukraine is exceptionally flat, except for Donetsk Ridge Hills near Donetsk, and most of the significant forests are also in the west. This makes it very hard to defend, as well as relatively ill-suited for insurgency movement, unlike, say, Chechnya or Afghanistan. One point to note here is that in the past, many Ukrainian insurgencies, including the resistance to the Soviet rule in 1930s to 50s, was based in the west, a much more mountainous and densely forested region. The insurgent leaders will no doubt try to organize urban resistance in the cities, but given the remarkable capabilities of the Russian intelligence services and extremely brutal methods they employ, they'll be able to identify and eliminate key leaders in fairly quick order. So having established control of the East, how does this solve Putin's primary objectives? Well, first, let's discuss what those might be. They are multiple. 1, to stop further NATO expansion into post-Soviet states. Yes, Putin and the rest of Russia's elites, going back to Gorbachev and the Yeltsin days, believe it is a threat, and no amount of Western pronouncements to the contrary will change that. Incidentally, the claims that NATO is a purely defensive alliance don't square well with Kosovo and Libya operations, which the Russians remember well, and I've also mentioned. The fact that they were done for humanitarian reasons provides no consolation for the current Russian leadership. And for Putin, NATO expansion does not only mean membership. He is also very concerned about NATO's involvement on the ground in Ukraine and Georgia, weapon sales, advisors and trainers, reconnaissance flights near Russian borders. He wants to put an end to it all. Number 2, bring Ukraine back into Russia's sphere of influence. In addition to stopping all NATO involvement in the country, he wants to reverse the pro-Western orientation of its policies. That includes ending any prospects for eventual EU membership. Putin has enjoyed remarkable success over the last few years in re-establishing firm Russian influence in much of the post-Soviet space. Armenia, Belarus, and most recently Kazakhstan have been brought firmly into the Russian sphere and at very little cost. An invasion of Ukraine would nearly complete Putin's project of restoring Russia's power in its near abroad. Given the justifiable anti-Russian feelings among the majority of Ukrainians, he knows that the only way to get influence over the Ukrainian government and their policies is through a change to their constitution and system of government. More on this in a bit. Number 3, diplomatically cement Russia's ownership of Crimea. Realists realize that Crimea is not returning back to Ukraine. No Russian leader would allow it, and Russia would go to war to keep it. And no one is going to be insane enough to try and fight them for it. In addition, the majority of the people of Crimea, except for the Tatar minority, and even they are warming up to Russian annexation, want to remain in Russia. Russia has dumped tens of billions of dollars into Crimean infrastructure, remaking much of the peninsula and integrating it deeply with the rest of Russia, physically, economically, and politically. And economically, life has objectively become significantly better for the people there. There is really no realistic imaginable scenario under which Crimea will rejoin Ukraine, and Putin undoubtedly wants an official Ukrainian rejection of their claims on the peninsula. 4. Resolution to the Donbass crisis. Russia does not want to own Donbass or suffer the burden of supporting it economically, which is one reason it hasn't annexed or recognized its independence. Plus, Putin needs the pro-Russian voters in that region to have influence in the Ukrainian government. So he will likely push for reintegration of Donbass in Ukraine, but on its own terms with a high degree of autonomy, what he tried with the Minsk agreements. Putin knows he can't get his way on any of these key points through negotiations with the US, which is why he is so likely to launch a major invasion, and a limited incursion will not achieve anything. So how does an invasion like the one I outlined help him achieve these goals? The first thing that is likely to happen in an invasion is the fall of the Zelensky government, who is already deeply unpopular in the polls in the low 30s. It is no accident that his political opponent and former President Poroshenko recently returned to Ukraine despite the threat of arrest for treason. He smells blood in the water. Much of Ukrainian export industry, agricultural, metallurgy, and heavy industry is based in the eastern side of the Dnieper River, as well as in the Odessa region. If Russia establishes de facto control over these areas, Ukrainian GDP will plummet. The pressure on whichever government emerges on the Western Bank will be immense. The economy will be in tatters. There'll be tens, if not hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing Russian troops from the east. The military will be decimated. Putin is counting on this. His objective will likely be to pressure the Ukrainian side under these horrifying conditions into a settlement. The proposal could look something like this. Change the Ukrainian constitution to create a Lebanon-style power-sharing political system. For example, a PM elected from Western side and a president from the east. This would give Russia permanent influence in Ukraine through their proxies in the east. In addition, Putin will insist on recognition of Crimea as a Russian territory, broad autonomy for the east, and a constitutional rejection of the pursuit of accession to NATO and/or the EU. In exchange, he will pull back his forces, at least overt ones, out of eastern Ukraine, but will likely keep intelligence operatives to continue influence campaigns. This gamble may or may not work for Putin. Ukrainians may very well launch a do-or-die resistance campaign to the bitter end and refuse to accept any deal. People leading it will likely be targeted for assassination. But Putin probably thinks that the combination of military and economic chokehold gives him a good chance to succeed. In summary, he is gambling that a rapid military operation in the east will result in a sufficient compellence campaign to bring Ukraine back into Russia's sphere of influence, recognition of Crimea as a Russian territory, and the resolution of Donbass. It will also establish a Putin doctrine of no further NATO expansion into post-Soviet space. Any country that decides to flirt with NATO will know that it risks invasion and loss of independence. The risks to this operation are, of course, substantial. The military campaign may not turn out to be as easy as he thinks, and may cost many more Russian lives than can be successfully hidden from the Russian public, as in past conflicts. Russia will suffer economic sanctions, although most severe sanctions against its oil and gas industry and major banks like Sberbank, VTB, and Gazprombank will likely not be put in place due to the blowback on European and US economies, as well as impact on already high energy prices. There will be further militarization on Russia's borders in NATO countries. Sweden and Finland may well opt to join the alliance at some point in the future. However, if he achieves his primary objectives, these costs will look minor in comparison to the historic and strategic gains he has acquired. That is the gamble he is looking at, and the lives of thousands of innocent people in Ukraine are hanging in the balance. Now, I know that this was a long thread, but well worth it. This is the sort of analysis one only normally gets in classified briefings, with teams of strategists looking at the threats, the opportunities, the assumptions, the facts, the spectrum of possible strategic futures. And yet, Dmitri has put this out there publicly for everyone to read. The only thing that I would even question with that analysis, I think the threat to Kyiv would be even greater than what he's put there. Because in order for Ukraine to terminate hostilities on the conditions that he's laid out, i.e. recognition of Crimea as part of Russia, the resolution of Donbass, and so on, the capital city would absolutely have to be under real threat. In fact, this might be the big question that Putin is thinking about right now. Can he actually put Ukraine in such a position that they would be willing to negotiate a gravely unfavorable peace? Now, with all the different threats to the Russian forces, that's a big and open question. The military equipment that's being provided both directly from the United States but also via third countries, such as the Baltic countries, is significant. UK trainers remain in Ukraine at the moment. And there are various economic sanctions that will be applied to the Russian economy. Will Russia be able to afford to maintain high-level military operations in Ukraine over an extended period? What happens if the conflict drags on for weeks, months, perhaps even years? Where would that leave Russia in the longer term? And this brings me to the other side of the equation. There are those that do not believe that Russia is ultimately going to invade, that this was all an elaborate bluff. Now that the bluff is being called, Putin is going to be looking at ways to climb down from the current brink. The top of that list would be the Ukrainian government at the moment. They have made several announcements talking about how, while the threat of invasion is real, they don't see it as imminent. They've lived with this for a long time. They think that any kind of Russian build-up on the border isn't a prelude to a massive invasion, but rather to destabilize the Ukrainian society, the Ukrainian economy, hurt business, create a sense of threat and coercion, but is not intended to do a large-scale land invasion of Ukraine and bring it to heel. They point to the fact that while, yes, military deployments have slowly increased on the Ukrainian border, they haven't amassed significantly beyond what had been reached a couple of months ago. They say that even the 127,000 troops deployed there, while significant, of course, is not sufficient to achieve a massive invasion with all the objectives and outcomes that the Russian forces would intend, and that they would be looking for several 100,000 more before they saw such an invasion as being imminent. Finally, it's possible that Vladimir Putin could simply declare victory and go home. After all, there is no appetite, it seems, for Ukraine to join NATO. Putin's aggression has exposed the different fissures and disagreements among the NATO members when it comes to Ukraine, but also deployments in the east. Putin may not wish to incur the costs and the backlash of the invasion when it comes to the military deployments in the Far East of Europe. The United States has announced they've got 8,500 more combat-ready troops that will be deployed to the Baltic countries if Russia invades Ukraine, with the promise of up to 50,000 more if necessary. Sweden and Finland very likely to apply to join NATO formally if Russia moves significantly into Ukraine. And so Putin could invade eastern Ukraine and gain some territory at great military cost and risk, but at the same time entrench and militarize the Far Eastern Europe area, which could have long-term strategic negatives for Russia. Russia may find it in its interest to wait for the challenge between China and the United States to play out a bit further, to intensify greater, perhaps even have a crisis over Taiwan before pushing into Eastern Europe again. I'm sure that Russia and China are coordinating these efforts very closely, calibrating when things are likely to occur. So they may have already seen that the United States has no appetite to put troops on the ground in Ukraine, but not only that, they're looking further away from NATO. If you see the domestic debate playing out in the United States, there is very little interest in increasing military deployments to Europe, either to deter Russia or because they see their strategic priorities as being in East Asia. Putin has exposed this in Europe. Meanwhile, the French and the Germans don't look like they're standing up to fill that role. The only country that's doing that in any meaningful way is the United Kingdom. They can't do that on their own. So Putin has kind of shown the destabilization within the European, the lack of consensus, the disagreements that exist between sort of Poland and the Baltic countries in Central Eastern Europe and the traditional NATO countries of Western Europe, and how these could actually be irreconcilable. So Putin has achieved some political outcomes here, and he could simply say, we are now confident that Ukraine will never be able to join NATO and pull his troops away from the border. He could do that in a semi-face-saving way, having absolutely failed to achieve any of the stated outcomes of his bilateral negotiations with the United States. Where do I think things are going to land? I honestly don't know. But there is one thing that the Americans have done right, which is successfully dominate the narrative. It is true that Russia would need a casus belli for attack, a reason to invade Ukraine, even if they manufacture it entirely themselves. The Americans have been very good at preempting this. They've played out much of the diplomacy in the public domain. They have let everybody know that if anything happens in Ukraine, it'll be because of Russia's doing and nothing to do with the aggression of the Ukrainians. And I think that there is a general consensus among the Western NATO countries that that is the case. So even if there isn't full solidarity behind Ukraine, even if there are fissures exposed diplomatically, politically among the various NATO member states, there is a general understanding that if Russia does invade Ukraine, it is the fault of the Russian government. It is absolutely nothing that the Ukrainians would have done to invite this, and it would be an unprovoked act of aggression by a belligerent and expansionist foreign power. That will change the calculation in Moscow, knowing that there would be significant political blowback. Is it going to be enough to stop Russia? I don't know. Putin will be thinking about his legacy. He's done all this work to bring it to this stage. Dmitri Alperovitch has given a great analysis of the way things more likely play out from a Russian point of view, provided everything goes their way, which is highly dubious, and Russia may simply decide that it is now or never. Thank you so much. I would love to hear your views on this. Do pray for Ukraine. It is a very difficult time for the people there, provided that it is possible to do it. When we go overseas a bit later on, we might travel to Kyiv and just interview some of the people there, provided obviously it's safe and able to do that. Otherwise, hopefully there'll be a positive outcome. Thank you so much. I will see you next time. Goodbye.